Hello, learners. I am Mnemonica. This time around, I thought I would turn my head away from the past and the fantasy world and into the future and the science fiction world, and all of the glittering landscapes brought to us by such great thinkers as William Gibson. Yes, the dark future of cyberpunk. As a tabletop gamer, when I think of cyberpunk, I generally think of Cyberpunk, the tabletop RPG put out by Art Halsorian Games. Cyberpunk 2020 is now being made into a computer game by CD Projekt Red called Cyberpunk 2077, and I'm kind of wondering if it's going to be a time skip or if they're just pushing the timeline forward. Cyberpunk has given fans a bit of a disagreement on the subject of cyberpsychosis. Cyberpsychosis is essentially a psychotic condition that's caused by having too many biocybernetic augmentations in the body. It is a psychiatric condition and is offset by the person's innate connection to other people and the world around them, as exemplified by the empathy stat. As a person gets more cybernetics, their empathy goes down and eventually bottoms out, at which point, in most cases, they go on a mad killing spree. This has created a bit of an issue because people don't like that system. It doesn't match up to what we think and what we know about how these things would work, and it just seems mostly as a way of preventing people from being the $10 million man. However, the issue of cyberpsychosis also brings one of the most iconic elements of the Cyberpunk 2020 setting, and that is the Max Tech response to a cyberpsycho. Max Tech is essentially the super augmented version of SWAT, designed to take out the rampant killing machines that are cyberpsychotics, and quite often they actually take them down alive and essentially reprogram them into being new Max Tech agents. Indeed, it's some speculation that the majority of Max Tech is actually composed of reprogrammed persons. So I thought I'd delve into two sides of this issue. One is the actual neurology that might in fact produce some form of cyberpsychosis, and the other is the discussion of whether or not Max Tech could actually respond to a cyberpsycho the way they do under the law as it exists today. Now, obviously, the law has changed between now and then, but looking at it through modern law could give us a few insights as to how the future law might change to provide any number of possible responses. Also, I need to point out that I do not actually agree with the legal theories that I'm going to be giving. I'm simply providing believable explanations for how the law might actually turn in the directions that it does in the game. So, first we discuss what is cyberpsychosis as a medical condition. The problem is that, in canon, there has never been an explanation of what cyberpsychosis is as a medical condition. I have done a bit of research to try to identify what it might actually be, but it needs to be emphasized that this explanation is entirely non-canonical and cannot be taken as a literal fact. It is a probable fact. The symptomology of cyberpsychosis, as described in Cyberpunk, is rather thin. It describes people as becoming colder, more distant over time as they get more and more cybernetics, eventually empathizing more with machines than with people, and eventually becoming irritated by any human interaction, which finally culminates in a violent outburst that leads to homicide and a Max Tech intervention. More information gained from snippets here and there in the material provides a deeper understanding of what this symptomology actually means. The coldness and lack of empathy can be explained as a form of dissociation, specifically the symptoms of derealization and depersonalization. Derealization is the process of perceiving either less reality or less validity or moral necessity of the world around you. Depersonalization is the same process directed inwards, and sometimes manifests as the person not perceiving themselves as making any decisions, but merely passively observing the behavior of their body. Another symptom that's mentioned quite often is paranoid personality disorder. This is distinct from paranoid delusions in that it isn't delusional. The person is looking at the rational world and coming to arguably irrational conclusions. One final symptom that oftentimes comes up is cyber addiction. However, this has no actual rules associated with it, and it appears to be more of an indirect consequence rather than a direct consequence of biocybernetic implantation. Of note is the fact that violence is never actually compelled by the condition up until the final terminal condition sets in, when humanity reaches zero and empathy reaches zero. Also of note is the fact that it is actually treatable in canon, and not by the removal of cybernetics. In fact, it states in the rules that MaxTac might approach somebody who has a very large amount of cybernetics and compel them into cyber registration. Once in cyber registration, they attend a therapy session a week. It isn't explained exactly what that therapy is, and they recover 2 points of humanity per week. This does not require the removal of cybernetics, and it appears as though the person can just get more cybernetics with the new humanity without any greater consequence than the usual humanity loss. Now, some people view this to be rules abusive. However, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm treating it as an ordinary part of canon because it goes very far towards explaining what the actual underlying causation is. In order to understand what might be happening, I'm turning to 2 articles of modern technology in the form of prosthetics that are directly thought-controlled. Dean Kamen's Luke arm is a thought-controlled prosthetic limb. Setting it apart is the fact that it moves very fluidly and with great precision, but it requires time, precision, and mastery to use. Dean Kamen himself has used the arm, but is incapable of using it with any kind of proficiency. By comparison, the HAL series of exoskeletons by Cyberdyne are also thought-controlled, but these will actually respond to the neural signals of the person. If the person missteps, they think that they have misstepped, and the exoskeleton realizes this and learns what a misstep is. In this way, the exoskeleton is actually doing the learning. From these technologies, we actually lead ourselves to a solution. That solution comes in the form of a technology that exists in the Cyberpunk universe, and that is the brain dance. A brain dance is essentially an override on the normal behaviors of a person. It is literally the opportunity to have a completely different personality. Variations on the brain dance technology allows someone to create a virtual experience that can then be replayed into somebody's consciousness directly, and several other possible technologies. One application of this is potentially to train the brain to do certain things, and certainly the MRAM chips that can be installed into a person can provide somebody with some baseline training in a skill that they have never experienced. The critical element is that cybernetics do not require any actual training to use. If somebody replaces their arm with a biocybernetic prosthetic, there is no learning process to using it. The probable method that is used to achieve this is to essentially feed into the brain information about how to interface with the device, essentially functioning as the HAL exoskeleton does, but in reverse. Now, as information accumulates in the brain, it is not actually stored within the synapses, but in connections between the synapses. New information occurs in the form of adding connections and in a process that's called axonic pruning, or the severing of connections. Creating new connections can break former connections. Normally, this doesn't cause significant problems, but doing this artificially and in a rapid pace can potentially lead to a number of complications. And for the purposes of this discussion, we will assume that those complications are the symptoms of cyberpsychosis. And so we have a basic model to construct the essential symptomology of the fundamental condition. The person who gets the biocybernetics will experience some incremental process of derealization and depersonalization. The initial effect of a single piece of cyberware will not be that significant, but it may be enough to cause somebody to feel as though something is simply wrong, potentially producing some of the paranoid symptoms of the condition. Additionally, they will get a sense of empowerment from the device. They have immediate and augmented capability. They may turn to this as a sort of security blanket and seek out more biocybernetic augmentation in order to achieve greater power. But in the process, they make the condition worse by expanding even further the process of depersonalization and derealization. The full-on condition of cyberpsychosis, which would probably go under a name such as acute biocybernetically induced dissociative condition or something along those lines, would occur at the point when the person's dissociation is so severe that it has completely undermined their own human identity. They no longer view the world in any form of moral terms, and they have no moral decision-making. They don't value anyone, not themselves or others, only the achievement of their own desires. At that point, the person is no longer functionally a person, and the treatment for this condition would involve completely removing the person from the foundation of their personal identity, which at that point is entirely contained within their biocybernetic augmentation. Thus, the augmentations are removed and replaced with cloned tissue, and brain dance technology is used essentially to rewrite their personality from the ground up. This also lends itself to a couple of rather chilling possibilities. One is that the actual removal of cybernetics does nothing to repair the personality of the person. The damage to neural connections is done. Thus, installing new cybernetics would simply cause more humanity loss, even if they are less invasive. And the removal of cybernetics and replacement with cloned tissue would simply remove the cybernetics and not restore any amount of humanity. Another potential consequence of this is the fact that a cyberpsycho is not necessarily going to immediately turn to violence. Indeed, a cyberpsycho who is getting their desires could in fact behave in a way that is almost functional and might pass without detection for some time. However, the condition is by its nature self-destructive, and eventually their world will fall apart. And as it does so, they will likely turn to violence simply as an outburst of outrage. Certainly, most cyberpsychos will become violent before they allow the police to arrest them. So now we have a description of the medical condition. So what are the legal consequences of that condition? A basic principle in the law is that a person is legally responsible for the reasonably predictable consequences of their intentional actions, even if the consequences of the intentional act is to lose control of behavior. Therefore, the person cannot get away with a crime simply because they have basic neural wear installed. They can't even get away with negligence for it. They are responsible for the natural consequences of having biocybernetic implants. And they are certainly responsible if they don't get the necessary medical attention to offset the consequences. In the case of a terminal condition, the final condition that is classically called cyberpsychosis, this leads to a bit of a legal conundrum. The definition of insanity in the common law is the inability to tell right from wrong due to mental deficiency or defect. Now, if a person is insane, they are not legally responsible for their actions. The problem is that that insanity is caused by the natural consequences of their intentional acts. Now, this issue is never mentioned or handled in discussion of the legal reaction to cyberpsychosis, so this isn't likely to be how the law addresses it, and Max Tech's response to cyberpsychosis points to the likely alternative solution. Max Tech has the ability to take a cyberpsychotic person, completely reprogram their brain, and turn them into another operative of Max Tech. How this is possible under the law to do this legally probably has something to do with the fact that the condition does completely undermine the human identity of the individual. In other words, the law regards the cyberpsycho as being legally dead. A dead person, naturally, has no legal rights. Thus, when Max Tech is taking action against a cyberpsycho, they can essentially do whatever they feel they need to, provided that they are not illegally infringing upon the rights of others. The cyberpsycho, having no rights, has no ability to complain. The cyberpsycho essentially functions as what is termed in the law a fugitive resource. A fugitive resource, such as a wild animal or water from a stream, becomes the legal property of the first person who can assert a legal claim, and one method of asserting that legal claim is to capture that resource. Therefore, when Max Tech steps in and captures a cyberpsycho, they are actually laying a legal claim upon them. One of the rather distasteful consequences of this, which makes it perfect for a cyberpunk setting, is the fact that the 13th Amendment does not apply to corpses. Since the person is legally dead, even when they have been reconstructed, that person remains the property of whomever captured them. Since the person now has a completely new identity, chances are that they are going to be reprogrammed into being a willing pawn or puppet for whatever agency rescued them. And under the law, that is how they are stuck. The only way that that will change is if they are sold to someone else. And this could actually legally be done because that person is not a person under the law. This leads us to a wonderful cyberpunk environment in which human beings are being traded as resources because they are treated under the law as drones. And nobody really argues if somebody sells a predator drone to somebody else unless that predator drone was stolen from the government. So, this has been my delve into the grim darkness of the cyberpunk future in all of its glittery glory, and my explanation for cyberpsychosis and for Max Tech being able to legally do what it does. Thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, or at least that you learned something from it.